Welcome to the world of exploration. Welcome to the world of learning. Let's start exploring, let's start learning. Poetry is the rhythmical creation of beauty in words, rightly stated by Edgar Allan Poe. I repeat, poetry is the rhythmical creation of beauty in words, rightly stated by Edgar Allan Poe. Alright, so the next slide states that American poet Robert Frost said shrewdly that poetry was what got left behind in translation, which suggests a criterion of almost scientific refinement. When in doubt, translate whatever comes through in prose. The remainder is poetry, and yet to even so acute a definition, the obvious exception is startling and a formidable one. Some of the greatest poetry in the world is the authorized or King James version of the Bible, which is not only a translation but also as its appearance in print, identifiable neither with verse nor with prose in English, but rather with cadence owing something to both. Moving on to the next slide, we get to see that how poetry is when an emotion has found its thought and the thought has found words. That's what we call, or that's what when we refer to poetry, that's what it means. That poetry is when an emotion has found its thought and the thought has found its meaning, that is words, because words convey meaning. Now we are going to deal with some of the poetic devices. Let's start with conceit. It's a literary device in which an author describes a complicated concept using simple language. Clear? So, a literary device in which an author describes a difficult concept using simple language, that's called conceit. Apostrophe is a literary device in which a character speaks to an absent person or thing. So it's a literary device in which a character speaks to an absent person or a particular thing. That is known as apostrophe. Then caesura, that's a literary device that is used to create a pause in the line of poetry. It's a literary device that is used to create a pause in a line of poetry. Then we talk about metonymy and synecdoche. So metonymy and synecdoche or synecdoche are the literary devices that involve using a part of something to represent the whole. Then we move on to the oxymoron literary device, that is an oxymoron. What do we actually mean by an oxymoron? It's a literary device that combines two contradictory terms or terminologies or words. Clear? Alright, let's move on to the next slide. Then we talk about zeugma. A zeugma is a literary device that uses one verb or adjective to modify two nouns. So it's a literary device that uses one verb or adjective, one verb or adjective to modify two nouns. Then we talk about repetition. Repetition refers to repeating words or phrases. Then we move on to consonants and assonance. Repeating consonant or vowel sounds. Alright. Then euphony and cacophony. The former is pleasing to the ear while the latter is harsh. So whenever we talk about something that is pleasant, we refer to it as euphony, and whenever we talk about something that is harsh in nature, we are talking about cacophony. Then we move on to meter. Meter is the rhythm of a poem, often created using stressed and unstressed syllables. So meter is the rhythm of the poem, often created using stressed or unstressed syllables. Here. Then we move on to parallelism. The use of similar grammatical structures in close proximity. Rhyme, the repetition of sounds at the end of the words. Here. Then foil, the use of two characters who are in contrast to each other. So whenever we used to make use of two characters who are basically contrasting in nature, they are very different from each other, we refer to it as foil. Then we move on to diction, the choice of words used. So whenever we make any use of words, the choice of selection of those words refers to diction. Then we move on to mood, the feeling or atmosphere that a piece of writing creates, that refers to mood. Then we come on to foreshadowing, the use of clues or hints to suggest what will happen later in the story. In media res, starting the story in the middle of the action. So whenever we start the story in the middle of the action, we start from the middle, then we refer to it as media res. Suspense is creating a feeling of anticipation or unease, that refers to suspense. Then dramatic irony, when the audience knows something that the characters do not, so that is dramatic irony. When the audience is familiar with what is going to happen, what is going to take place, but the characters are not familiar with how the play or how the story is going to unravel it. Alright, then we move on to vignette, that is a short descriptive scene. Clear? Then flashback, a scene that interrupts the present action to show events from the past. So a scene that basically interrupts the present action to show events from the past. Soliloquy, when we talk about soliloquy, a character talking to themselves. So whenever a character is talking to, personally talking to, and is basically thinking, perceiving something, is talking to themselves, that is soliloquy. And the more common literary devices are alliteration. These are more common in nature. Alliteration refers to the repetition of initial sounds in the words that are close to each other. Then we move on to metaphor, a figure of speech that compares two things that are not alike. So whenever there is a comparison between two things that are not alike, that means they are different from each other, we make use of metaphor. Then comes simile, that is the figure of speech that compares two things using the words, as in like. Clear? Symbolism refers to the use of objects or actions to represent something else. Then personification. Personification is a literary device that gives human characteristics to inanimate objects. Hyperbole is a literary device that uses exaggeration for effect. Irony, there are three types of irony: verbal irony, situational irony, and dramatic irony. So irony is of three types. It's of three types: verbal irony, situational irony, and dramatic irony. Clear? Then we move on to juxtaposition, the placement of two things side by side for effect. So the placement of two things side by side for creating a desired effect. Clear? That is juxtaposition. Paradox. A paradox is a literary device that contradicts itself but contains a truth. So paradox is a literary device that contradicts itself but contains a truth, that is actually telling the truth but is contradictory in nature. Then allusion. Allusion is a literary device that refers that references a person, place, thing, or event. So in which basically allusion is alluding to something, whether it be a person, a place, a thing, or an event. Allegory. Allegory is a literary device that uses characters or events to represent ideas. So whenever the author feels like presenting or representing certain ideologies or ideas, they can take the help of allegory, which is again a literary device. Then imagery. Imagery is the use of descriptive language to create images in the reader's mind. So imagery is the use of descriptive language to create images. So whenever images have to be imagery is basically using of descriptive language in order to create images in the reader's mind. So if the author feels like creating images through words in reader's mind, then he or she makes use of imagery. Pathetic fallacy. The pathetic fallacy is a literary device that attributes human emotions to inanimate objects. So whenever human emotions are attributed to inanimate objects, that is what we call as, or we refer to as, pathetic fallacy. Again, it's a literary device. Then ekphrasis. Ekphrasis is a literary device that uses descriptive language to evoke a work of art. Alright, again we are talking about the descriptive language. So it makes use of descriptive language to evoke a work of art. Onomatopoeia is a literary device that uses words to imitate sound. So whenever words, it makes use of words that sound like sounds, right? Anaphora is a literary device that uses repetition for emphasis. So anaphora uses repetition in order to emphasize a certain fact. Clear? Epistrophe. Epistrophe is a literary device that uses repetition for emphasis. It also uses repetition in order to emphasize something. Then pun. A pun is a literary device that uses words that have multiple meanings. So whenever a word has a dual meaning, it refers to as pun. Again, a literary device. Then we move on to epithet. Epithet is a literary device that uses a descriptive word or a phrase. Again, we are talking about the descriptive word or a phrase. Clear? Caesura is a literary device that is used to create rhythm in a piece of writing. It is usually used in poetry, but it can also be used in a prose. So it's not necessarily that it needs to be used in poetry. It can also be used in prose. Caesura is created by using a pause in the middle of a line or a text. So it is created by using a pause in the middle of a line or a text. This pause can be created by using a comma, and this pause can be created by using a comma, a semicolon, or a period. All these three things can be used in order to create caesura. When we talk about semicolon, when we talk about period, when we talk about comma. Clear? It can also be created by using a word that has multiple meanings, such as and or but. Even and or but, they can act as words that have multiple meanings. Clear? Caesura can be used to create a sense of rhythm in a piece of writing, which can make it more enjoyable to read. So it can also be used to create a sense of rhythm in a piece of writing. It can also be used to create a sense of tension or suspense in a piece of writing. Clear? Then in poetry, metonymy and synecdoche are two literary devices that are often used to create vivid images. Metonymy is a figure of speech that involves using a word or a phrase to refer to something else, usually something closely associated with it. For example, the phrase all hands on deck, clear, is a metonym for everyone. Synecdoche, so all hands on deck, is a metonym for everyone. Why? Because it's a figure of speech that involves using a word or a phrase to refer to something else, usually something closely associated with it. Synecdoche, on the other hand, is a figure of speech that uses a part of something to represent the whole. For instance, the phrase wheels can be used to refer to the car. Understood? So wheels is a part of something big,